Hello, everybody. My name is Pablo Boczkowski, and I'm a faculty member at Northwestern University. I'm also the director of the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Thank you so much for joining us for today's weekly virtual seminar of the Center. It's really a pleasure to have you with us today. The mission of the Center is to create knowledge about digital media in Latinx communities across the Americas, and today's speaker is an absolutely leading scholar in this space. Mari Castañeda is Professor of Communication and Dean of the Commonwealth Honors College at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Crystal Camargo, a doctoral candidate in the Department of Radio, Television, and Film at Northwestern and an affiliate at the Center for Latinx Digital Media, will introduce Mari in just a minute. I'm delighted to note that today's talk is co-sponsored by the Alice Kaplan Institute for the Humanities, the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs, and the Latina and Latino Studies program. But before we go into the seminar, I would like to start by acknowledging that Northwestern is a community of learners situated within a network of historical and contemporary relationships with Native American tribes, communities, parents, students, and alumni. It is also in close proximity to an urban Native American community in Chicago and near several tribes in the Midwest. The Northwestern campus sits on the traditional homelands of the people of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ottawa, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. It was also a site of trade, travel, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other native tribes, and is still home to over 100,000 tribal members in the state of Illinois. It is within Northwestern's responsibility as an academic institution to disseminate knowledge about Native peoples and the institution's history with them. Consistent with the university's commitment to diversity and inclusion, Northwestern works towards building relationships with Native American communities through academic pursuits, partnerships, historical recognitions, community service, and enrollment efforts. Let me briefly say how the seminar will unfold. First of all, Crystal will tell us more about Mari's research and career in just a minute. Then Mari will deliver her seminar. After that, we will open for questions. Please enter your questions in the Q&A function of the webinar. Crystal will moderate. At the end, we will deliver some closing remarks. Once again, many thanks for joining us. And without further ado, Crystal, the screen is all yours.
Thank you, Pablo, for that kind introduction and for the opportunity to introduce today's guest speaker. Dr. Mari Castañeda is a professor of communication and a recently named Dean of Commonwealth Honors College at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Aside from being a full professor in the Department of Communication, Dr. Castañeda is an affiliate and associate faculty member for the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino Studies, Department of English, and the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program. Years at UMass Amherst, she has served as the Chancellor's Leadership Fellow, Chair of the Department of Communication, as well as the Associate Dean of Equity and Inclusion in the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences. Inaugural committee that established the Latino-Latina Studies Association Conference and has previously served as co-chair to the National Association for Chicano-Chicana Studies and the Latinx Caucus for Society for Cinema and Media Studies, to name a few. Internal and external awards for her service, teaching, and commitment to diversity and inclusion. Dr. Castañeda's research interests include the study of digital media, telecommunication policy, Latinx media studies, and cultures of care. Her work aims to address inequity, power, community voices, and the role of intersectionalities in shaping media and cultural spaces. Her scholarship has appeared in multiple journals, edited volumes, collections, and she has also published co-authored or co-edited books. These books are Telenovelas and Soap Operas in the Digital Age, Global Industries and New Audiences, Mothers in Academia, and Civic Engagement in Latinx Communities from Social Justice Partnerships in Action. In today's presentation titled Voicing Racism and Resistance, Critical Communication Theory Analysis of the Build the Wall discourse, Dr. Castañeda focuses on the discursive material and symbolic power of seemingly innocuous expressions such as build the wall to understand the...
Thank you so much, Crystal, for a very kind introduction, and sorry for the technical problems. Mari, the screen is all yours.
Thank you so much, Pablo. Thank you, Mora and Crystal and Facundo for inviting me to be here. We're in the Zoom context, right? So these things happen. But thank you so much, Crystal, for that wonderful introduction. I'm so excited to be here and to share with all of you the work that I've been engaged with some wonderful, amazing colleagues. And I'm looking forward to the discussion afterwards. And again, thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here part of the Latinx Digital Media Virtual Seminar Series, and I'm just again looking forward to hearing some of the Q&A that folks may have afterwards. I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint here for a second. So this is a collaborative project that I've been involved in and was involved in with two amazing, wonderful colleagues, Dr. Sonia Aleman and Dr. Claudia Anguiano. Oops, I'm sorry about this. Moving on here. Dr. Claudia Anguiano Evan Cepeda. And so it's important for me to acknowledge them because they were such an important part of this project. We've been working together for many years now, and we like to engage as what we call academic tamaleando. And this notion of academic tamaleando is really an effort to produce work that provides sustenance for us, for our students, and for the communities that we work with, because sometimes the projects that we do in Latinx media studies oftentimes do bring a lot of joy, but there's also some projects, especially when we're examining racism and its impact in our communities, in our families, and our own personal lives that are difficult and are heavy and are hard. And so as a result of these academic tamaleadas that we have together, Claudia and Sonia and I, it really is a way of taking care of our spirits and our hearts, and this collective effort and the work that we're doing. And of course, three brains are always better than one. So that's one of the reasons why we work together so much and so well. But I wanted to acknowledge them because they are central to this work and central to my own understanding and the development that I've had over the years intellectually. And so I want to begin with also noting that this particular project was also published in 2019 in a wonderful collection called Latina, Latino, Latinx Communication Studies. And it really brings together an array of scholarship that is really focusing on and examining identity, academic experiences in the current political climate, language, identity, Latinidades in health. And so it brings a whole array of scholars that are looking at these issues from a whole variety of areas, but really centralizing it with regards to communication studies. And even though there's been a lot of work that's been produced at the intersection of Latino studies, Chicano studies, Puerto Rican studies, and media studies and Latino studies, there still is a lot more to do. And there's a growing group of scholars and scholarship that's producing it, but there's so much to examine, so much to investigate, so much to understand. There's still plenty for us to examine and look at. And so this book is part of that, that effort. And so this particular project, which actually began before the book was published, and we were invited to submit a chapter to this book, became a perfect opportunity to really delve deeper as to what were the issues that we were trying to examine as a result of this particular sort of phrase. But part of it also has to do that we were very dismayed by the way in which Build That Wall was becoming such an important flashpoint in political rallies and beyond. And so, as we all know, in 2016, the former president notoriously began his presidency indiscriminately characterizing Mexicano immigrants in his campaign as, again, inflammatory positions with regards to unauthorized immigration, border defenses, national security, that were epitomized by this phrase of build that wall and that chant that became an important part of these rallies that he was holding throughout. And of course, had promised, which did not happen, but promised to develop a 2,000-mile long wall along the US-Mexico border that the Mexican government would pay for. And this rhetoric, as we note here, spotlights the current and growing material and discursive presence of Latino subjectivities in the US. And consequently, we felt that it was really imperative for us and other communication scholars to spend some time examining the discursive and symbolic power of these discourses, such as the seemingly, again, innocuous term of expression of build that wall, but in fact having some serious consequences and impact for young people and for Latinx communities. I also wanted to note here, as you can see, this is a word, sort of word cloud that captures a lot of what 45 was saying in a lot of speeches, a lot of the coverage that was happening as a result of the campaign, and also afterwards. And so Mexico, immigration, build that wall, walls in general, all these different pieces were an important part of that, and were increasingly sort of utilized and weaponized in particular ways that we were also increasingly very upset about and worried. And we did feel that build that wall was especially most hurtful. I wanted to also point that this past Sunday, the New York Times had a review of some of the, as they note here, some of the weighty and whimsical catchphrases and totems that emerged as a result of the former presidency. And walls, as noted here in the sort of picture that I have, is one of the ones that, again, as the New York Times notes, once innocuous, wall talk now comes loaded with incendiary questions, will Mexico pay? And so the build that wall phrase no longer is really about national security, and it becomes about the ways in which who gets included and to be part of the nation and who doesn't is the thing that we wanted to examine and look carefully, but also what are the ways in which communities are also pushing back and resisting the ways in which those phrases are trying to characterize folks. Because again, although disguised as a cry for increased national security, this catchphrase really capitalized on the escalating resentment of growing Latina, Latino, Latinx populations. And it really is rooted in legacies of xenophobia, nativism, colonialism, and white supremacy that have marred the experiences of Mexicano and Latina descended peoples in the Americas since the early 1800s, when Anglo settlers began colonizing the southern and western regions of the United States. And so indeed, this expression gained rhetorical traction in the public and private discourse as it was used as an insult to threaten and terrorize school children, Mexican citizens, Latinos in the US in the weeks and months following the election and since then. And social media and video accounts documented many of these taunts that predicated on declarations of build that wall. And so it's important to sort of note that also the increased potency of this expression that became very, very disturbing for the ways in which particularly young people, school-aged children and teens were deriding and intimidating Latinx students using this slogan that helped construct a contextualized depiction of this rhetorical reverberations and the ways in which it was affecting beyond just these rallies and into the larger public sphere and into the private discourse of schools and communities and so forth. And again, wanted to also note that the Southern Poverty Law Center also noted that there was that they interviewed teachers and that there was a 90% increase in the ways in which it was increasing the negative impact that the racial climate was happening in their schools. And Documenting Hate Project was one of the ways that was demonstrating that the hate crimes and bias that was being manifested into threats and violence against Latinas and Latinos of racialized, marginalized groups. So for instance, when we began this project, we did an online search on Google to see how many times and how many stories were being developed in the media, but also stories that people were writing about with regards to how build that wall was being used. And we uncovered a disturbing number of occurrences, again, especially of school-age children. And I think that that's the thing that disturbed us and hurt us the most, because our own children were also being affected by that. And the children of our various friends and the various communities we were part of, and they weren't just Mexicano, they were also Latino from a variety of different ethnic backgrounds, racial backgrounds that were being affected as a result of this. And it was indiscriminately being used. And yet children and teens were deriding Latino students using this slogan. For instance, 7th and 8th graders at a Michigan school chanted, "Build that wall," while banging on their lunch tables in the cafeteria the day after the election. A video of the commotion went viral and capturing over 5 million views and generating actually discord between those that felt that the students responsible for or the chants were not sufficiently reprimanded, while others felt that the behavior warranted no punishment at all because the students, they didn't know what they were doing and they were simply quoting the incoming president. And yet at the same time, the hurt that was produced and impact and affected in those young Latino students in that space was not necessarily taken as seriously, and yet it really did have an impact. In Texas, middle school students similarly intoned "Build That Wall" as they were passing by a Latino neighborhood. In Spokane, Washington, several white middle school students jeered and chased a Latino peer, calling out "Build That Wall," as did a third grade Anglo boy from Kentucky who shouted this while chasing a Latina classmate around the room. Middle schoolers in Virginia were also overheard by teachers teasing Latino, Latinx students with "Build That Wall" jokes, while Latino parents in Ohio contacted the school after their children shared with them stories of being heckled by students with the phrase "Build That Wall." And as you can see, this is not something that is just being used in political rallies. It is particularly being used as a weapon against certain individuals. And in this case, it's being used against children. The impact on younger Latino immigrant youth was especially worrisome for us. And again, not only did we see it in the impact on our own families and the communities that we're part of, but also we heard many on and offline stories about how, again, this phrase was being not simply just sort of said in jokingly, but really how it was being weaponized. I also want to give the example. My brother went on a 5K run in San Diego, and a group of Mexicanos runners were running with him through this 5K, and a group of spectators, largely white. And I do want to state that it's not just white folks that were using this phrase. For sure, there were many people of color that also participated, because again, white supremacy doesn't know, is utilized by these folks too sometimes. And so unfortunately, as he's running, these Mexicano runners are also running with him, and people start chanting "Build That Wall" as these Mexicano runners are running in the 5K. And there's no purpose, no reason for that to be taking place except to intimidate, except to terrorize, except to make them feel that they do not belong and they didn't belong in that space. And one of the things that he told me was that not only he and other runners were shouting back at these spectators, and shouting back at that point where the Muslim ban had happened, and there was a lot of debate about that and pushback legally as well, that they were started yelling "No ban, no wall" as a sort of pushback to that. But it sort of demonstrates that, again, how it gets used beyond that, just outside of just political rallies themselves. And so given the implications for Latino communities as a result of this inflammatory rhetoric, we wanted to use this framework that could be used as a touchstone for understanding this analysis. What is going on? Why is this happening? How can we make better sense of it? And what could be done, to push back and to also examine the ways in which communities have agency and are expressing resistance when these types of, again, they seem like they're just words. Well, they're words that matter and that have impact and that really affect people's lives, not just discursively and spiritually, but also physically and materially, because there's also lots of instances that we found online that were describing and characterizing how it was having these other types of effects. So again, using this framework of the Latinx critical communication theory was an attempt again to examine this as a communicative event that could be deconstructed for the underlying ideologies that racialize Latino, Latinx communities discursively, as well as how these same communities are contesting this bombastic rhetoric and pushing back, for it has also spurred such communities to resist and counter these harmful and degrading language in creative and courageous ways that are not just happening by pushing back in schools or again, yelling back "No ban, no wall," or also, writing articles and using the media itself to challenge how this particular phrase was no longer about national security, but really about demonizing particularly Latinos in particular, but also immigrant groups were also wrapped into that particular phrase as well. And so the framework utilizes 5 tenets: centralizing Latinx experiences, deploying decolonizing methodologies, acknowledge and addressing racism aimed at Latino, Latina, Latinx communities, and resist colorblind post-racial rhetoric, and also promoting a social justice dimension. And this particular framework was developed by bringing together critical race theory, Lat-Crit theory, and Latinx media studies in order to really examine the material, verbal, visual, discursive experiences of Latinos, particularly in this vast social media context that we're in now. And it really does draw from race-based communication theories as well as a way to explain and critique racialized communication phenomenon as it pertains particularly to multiracial, multi-ethnic experiences of Latinos. The fact that these frameworks, that critical race theory is such a powerful framework that the former White House administration created an executive order, as many of you know, in fall of 2020, just this past fall, deriding and banning critical race theory, which again demonstrates how crucially important and effective it is for analyzing racism in institutions, practices, and policies, and why a lot of the legal and educational field has really engaged with these particular theoretical frameworks. And so myself and Claudia had earlier developed this framework as a way of trying to move it into a communication and media studies context, but broadening it out a little bit more in order to sort of think about how we can utilize these various methodologies, for instance, acknowledging the racism, but also in terms of the social justice component, which is the 5th tenet, that a lot of communities also have agency and are pushing back. So we didn't want to just describe how white supremacy becomes imbued in these communicative acts, but also how people in communities are pushing back in that context. And so we use this theory in this particular project to make sense of what we see taking place in this particular phenomenon, because again, we were also feeling it viscerally, and we were seeing it, and we were trying to understand it along with our students and how to make sense of this. So the framework brings together these various different theories as a way of creating a larger sort of context for the way that these tenets can be utilized. So the first one, and I want to sort of walk you through what these tenets are, and then sort of show a little bit about how it was utilized for this project, but also as a way of grounding it. So one of the things that's important to understand with regards to the Latina, Latino, Latinx critical communication theory that was being developed and utilized here is to really understand, rooted in the understanding that race is beyond the Black and white binary, as a way of really trying to understand what is the experiences for Latinx communities in particular. So not only racism, sexism, and classism, but that this diverse group is also experiencing, as noted here, issues of linguisticism, colorism, nativism, xenophobia, transnationalism, post-coloniality, diaspora, neoliberalism, globalism, imperialism. So that these intersecting experiences need to be taken into account. These history and conditions often create limiting socioeconomic political conditions for Latina, Latinos, not just living in the US, but we're focusing on folks living in the US in particular. And so the point of this particular tenet is to really recognize that and to centralize that experience, and to really focus it and make it the primary sort of key point that we're going to begin the analysis. So for instance, really taking into account the settler history of Mexican American communities. And so the context of Build That Wall has to be also examined within this particular context. That again, in the ways in which the promise to close the US-Mexico border, for instance, and not the US-Canadian border, is really sort of looking at the ways in which unwanted people are being imagined. And again, the unwanted people, not from the North, but particularly from the global South and from Latino America and from Mexico in particular. And so that the utilization of Build That Wall is again, moving us away from simply about national security, but also about who gets to belong in the US, who gets to belong in making space and place in these various different places. Well, then we also have have to acknowledge what is that history, the contextualizing that history of Latino presence in the US, and also recognize the anti-Latino sentiment that's not just recent, but that's been around for a very, very long time, and really at the founding of the making of particularly the nation, but moving towards the Southwest and the West Coast as that whole area that was traditionally, historically Mexicano became, of course, part of the US as part of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And so that history and that contextualization becomes very important for centralizing that experience. So second, with regards to decolonizing methodologies, one of the things that we're really concerned about when examining that is that we didn't want to, again, reproduce trauma that this particular phrase is inflicting on folks. And in fact, wanting to think about how can we use a decolonizing methodology and examining what's happening that in fact can be a source of healing and liberation, and seeking that rather than trying to focus on sort of traditional methods that oftentimes don't take into account historical ways of knowing. So drawing on methods that prioritize embodied knowledge, that targeting, again, how this language accounts for the emotive, intellectual, psychic ways of experiencing this utterance becomes very, very important to take into account. And as a result, one of the things that we sort of talk about in this particular project and sort of use and look at is, for example, the variety of critical race-based and gender-based and indigenous-based methods, such as counter storytelling and testimonios, could be utilized as a way of understanding how that build that wall rhetoric is impacting communities and impacting youth in particular, rather than questionnaires or experiments. And so really be taking into account those particular histories and voices that are important for doing that. Important because it's one of the things that we just want to make sure that there is a greater reflexivity in the work between researcher and the communities that we're engaging with in these analyses, in order to create a space for the co-construction of knowledge. And then that's an important part of what we were attempting to do with this project and utilizing this particular framework. The other thing that's in that, and so again, for instance, thinking about what is the function and the implications of young people yelling Trump, 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 or build that wall at high school athletic games, and what is the impact that it has on Latinx students and their communities? How do we make sure that the methods that we're engaging with and the analysis that we're doing, again, doesn't reproduce trauma, but takes those voices into account, that is able to also not only be acknowledged, but then ultimately push back in the ways that it's trying to inflict harm and pain as a result of it being utilized constantly. And so the third tenet is about acknowledging and addressing the racism faced by the Latino community. So again, recognizing that there is racism that's being utilized here, and also that this pattern of behavior display a form of coded discursive hostility based on racism and nativism that becomes a proxy, right? It becomes a proxy for white power that again evokes that you as Latinos, Latinas, Latinx communities, you do not belong. And so the sound bites promoted at certain political rallies and even high school rallies and civic events, thus has been transformed into racist discourse and hate speech rooted in xenophobia and white supremacist ideologies. And that's ultimately one of the things that we're arguing, is that build that wall is not just sort of simply this phrase that doesn't do anything and is not communicating this hate or xenophobic ideologies. It absolutely is. And it is not simply because of what it's saying, but the ways in which it's being utilized in the spaces. We have to examine what are the ways in which it's being promoted and enacted as a phrase, as a sort of as something that's being sort of put upon, communities themselves, and that it's being used as a sort of racist form of encountering and engaging, and not really even engaging, but coming at, these communities themselves. So for instance, here I wanted to note that, the percent of Latinos that have been personally discriminated against in each situation because they are Latino. So again, the ongoing racist rhetoric directed at Latinx communities can be viewed as an attempt to erase their ties to the US US and evoke a message that, again, we don't belong here in multiple spaces and places and stories, and that we don't have that space to be here. But in fact, we've been here for a very long time and have made incredible different impacts and interventions, but that we're continuously, again, feeling that discrimination and racism that needs to be acknowledged and examined carefully and recognized. And how does that, again, the phrase of build that wall, perpetuate that, as well. So the fourth tenet really focuses on the sort of color blindness and post-raciality that seem to be making a big push particularly after Obama's 8-year term presidency. But the reality that, in fact, that kind of approach really does not take into account the ways in which we're not in that moment. And we have to acknowledge the ways in which we're not in a post-racial context by any means whatsoever. So by focusing on the legal system, for instance, as it pertains to establishing citizenship, on the current immigration policies and practices, and of course, this notion of the right to free speech. So again, that's another thing that sort of intersects with this issue with regards to build that wall, not only at rallies, but in schools and in various different civic events, is that the raciality of build that wall is both evaded and reinscribed by focusing on simply it being a free speech moment. It's important to recognize that color blindness and post-raciality in these communicative acts, and how do they take place and what are they doing? And in this case, again, evading and reinscribing the raciality that doesn't recognize how Latinos are racialized in these various different contexts. And so, for instance, here, just to sort of read what a superintendent noted, and this was an article that was in the New York Times, when a school district in Idaho apologized for Mexican costumes and a mocking of the border wall. Do I think that there was a malicious intent and poor decision? No, I don't, he said in Facebook video posted on Friday. Was there a poor judgment involved? Absolutely. He added that he was deeply troubled by the decision by our staff members to wear those costumes that are clearly insensitive and inappropriate. But again, it sort of gets phrased as something that, again, is inappropriate and insensitive, but doesn't really recognize the racism that actually is being promoted by these teachers in, having these costumes and the impact that this has, particularly with young people that were in their schools, and the kind of trauma and pain that it causes for those students and communities. And again, it wasn't just Latino students, it was also students of color that are also being affected by this. And so you really see that it ends up having a reverberation that are beyond just that particular community and starts extending beyond. And it's this notion that it's a colorblind or post-racial, and it's just sort of people that don't know what they're doing and just sort of being insensitive, when in fact, this becomes in many ways a racist act. And how does that happen then? How do we see that? And it's not just the act itself, it's the impact that it also has with various people that then come in contact or feel like it's directed at them as well. And so the last tenet really focuses on the social justice dimension, how many Latino communities and allies are using art and comedy and ingenuity as a way of pushing back against these negative undertones and build that wall. And I have to say, the fact that we are not seeing as much of those particular sort of that phrase being used at high school rallies anymore, or being used in elementary schools, and the ways that it was used much more, is because people were pushing back. It's because parents wrote to their superintendents. It's because people were saying, this is unacceptable. This is no longer about border security. This is really about terrorizing individuals, particularly that are coming from a Latino, Latinx background, but it also is much broader than that as well. And it really is about creating a context of exclusion for various different communities. And the fact that, again, we started seeing a push against this, and we are not seeing it as much, means that it really did work, that people had agency, that people were resistant, that people were saying enough is enough, this is unacceptable. And not only in various different communities across the US that we're doing this, but also in a variety of different spaces. So how do we think about cultural production and Latinx community university partnerships, developing counter narratives about Latina, Latinos in local communities? So that also becomes one of the ways in which that that tenet of the last tenet of social justice dimension is, how do we utilize those opportunities for community-based partnerships between faculty, community, and students as a way of also pushing back in these various contexts, not just the context of build that wall and the harm and the hurt that it produces, but a whole variety of different things as well that oftentimes get developed. And so I just wanted to point this particular local Latino Spanish language bilingual, actually more bilingual community program that is in WGBY really is focusing on the diversity of the Latinx community in Western Massachusetts and New England more broadly, but really is trying to demonstrate the various different counter narratives that are being developed that challenge the more mainstream sort of stories that are utilized about Latinos in the U.S. I also wanted to note here that the way in which this particular framework of the Latino critical communication theory is being utilized is this recent article on Remaking Television One Day at a Time's Digital Delivery and Latino Cultural Specificity, that the framework is now also being expanded, sort of thinking about popular culture as well, not just news items that are out there that are sort of popularized, but also how popular culture can be examined through using this particular kind of framework as well, that that is really meant to be more critical, but also highlighting the ways in which, and in this context here, that this Cuban American family, for instance, as a form of broad audience appeal, and it negotiates sexual identity, immigration discourses, but also is really sort of centering the Latinx experience itself and the importance of that. And so how do we use that framework to sort of make sense of that in that context? And so I wanted to point to this because not only is the framework being used in a variety of different ways, we were using it as a way of trying to make sense of Build That Wall and its impact that it's having. And again, we found that also it was having these negative impacts, but also the ways in which people were resistant and pushing back on the on its usage and what it does. And so I wanted to end because I know that folks might have some questions and some feedback about this presentation, but also just to demonstrate again, these are the various different ways that that along the US-Mexico border since 2016, there's been a whole variety of community-based and artwork that has been pushing back. Most recently, I believe that there was I was looking at a seesaw that was created that brought young people together from both sides to connect, even if of course they're not necessarily crossing the border itself, but it becomes a way of disrupting, of challenging, of reimagining that border that has been created, that again is socially, politically constructed, but also that it doesn't have to be the thing that defines not only this larger borderland space, but the people that occupy it both in that space, but beyond that as well. And so here are just sort of two examples that people come together to challenge and push back and rethink what is the border, and that Build That Wall becomes something that becomes disruptive, and that becomes that we can create other forms of not necessarily reinscribing that wall, but instead building connections, bridges, communities that are supportive and trying to sort of connect with one another as well. So I'm going to end there. And again, thank you so much for the opportunity to share this work. There's a lot to do and a lot of things that I think are possible. And I'm excited for thinking through with you all, what are other ways in which, we can utilize not only the framework, but what are the impacts that people have seen with regards to Build That Wall, or how they've seen it in their own communities or their own youth in schools, in terms of how it's been utilized and weaponized oftentimes to taunt young children in particular, and the harm that creates as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Castañeda, for this great seminar. I also want to apologize for the introduction. I don't know what happened with my internet connection. It, of course, always fails at the worst possible time, so I apologize if I didn't get completely through the introduction. As you were giving your presentation, I felt myself feeling a lot of similar feelings that I had when the rhetoric Build the Wall first came out. And my sister is a high school teacher. She also has a 9-year-old that at the time was in 3rd grade, and her classmates were telling her to go back to Mexico, despite the fact that she's like a 3rd generation born in the United States. So like as you were explaining that, I found myself like feeling some of those emotions and kind of struggling with my sister, like how do you explain what's going on nationally to a 9-year-old that hasn't really experienced racism or discrimination and doesn't understand that why her friends like overnight switched, right, from being her friends from now saying these awful things. Which then kind of got me thinking about the 5 different steps that you have in your theory. One of them, of course, is when you talk about deploying decolonizing methodologies. You discuss about how like it's important to retell without reproducing trauma. And I just wanted to see, like, as a scholar who's doing this important work, like, how do you take care of yourself when doing this research?
That's a great question, Crystal. I mean, I think that this is why the collaborative work is so important in working in comunidad. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the academic tamaleando, and we called it tamaleando because we do see ourselves as bringing all these different selves of ourselves together, different experiences and histories, but also the different strengths that we're building and sort of ultimate creating this work and this food that we feel is like sort of the knowledge base that it sort of sustains us. Because in those conversations, we're not just talking about the research itself. We feel like this research is also part of our lives and part of our communities and part of the ways in which we experience it. And so I do feel increasing, I mean, I felt for a very long time, and of course the whole academia thing, that's a whole other thing about solo working and so forth that, you know, folks have to demonstrate. But I do feel that in working collaboratively, we start pushing back against this notion of the solo researcher or the scholar up in some high tower, ivory tower. And so that's how we take care of ourselves, is working in comunidad with each other. But also the other thing that we've done, the 3 of us have done a lot of, is community-based research and community civic engagement work that really takes us out of our universities and into the communities. So for instance, when we were working on this project, I was working with some community-based organizations in Holyoke, Massachusetts, which actually has a large Boricua community there. And in talking to some of my friends and community partners there, they were saying that they were feeling that impact of Build That Wall rhetoric. And they're like, and I'm Puerto Riqueña, but, you know, and therefore, like in terms of the history of the island in relation to the US and so forth. But she was like, you know what, this is impacting me too. It's because they're not demonstrating any difference. And so working together with her and other folks, for me, not only broadened that understanding, but also gave me the sort of the community-based strength to be able to push back together, to develop counter stories, to work together and say that doesn't define us. But I think the collaborativeness is, I think, very, very key for being able to do that. And of course, being part of other organizations like the New England, the Consortium of Latino Studies also makes a big difference in coming together and having these conversations about the impact, because that's the thing. We don't want to reproduce the trauma with the folks that we're working with and the stories that we're sort of engaging with and collecting, and you know, and not just collecting, but really having them have the voice and say of how this is going to be represented as well. But also the thing that's important is that you know, we also don't want to reproduce the trauma for ourselves, because it is sometimes hard, like you were saying, that you could feel it as you're looking at this as well. But that's a great question, because I think that's an ongoing question we have to constantly reflect on and think about, because these things don't exist out there in the same way that people assume the research exists.
Right, right. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think as a young scholar, sometimes get stuck in just academia, and I often forget to reach out into the community, which has been even more difficult with the pandemic. But I really love the idea of like almost refueling or being re-energized, or perhaps having a different experience, not in academia, by, you know, being in comunidad. And I also love the concept of tamaleando. which I will have to adopt. That is amazing. Um, I wanted to also share that we're opening up the Q&A to the audience. I see that Dr. Mary Beltran has a question for us. She shares, thank you for this research, which is so needed and so important. Can you share your thoughts on how these important points can better reach journalists and the general public, especially considering how seldom scholars of Latino, Latina studies and Latino communication studies are asked to share their voices in the news media?
Oh, that's such a great question. Thank you, Dr. Bernal. Dr. Bernal, right? Asked the question? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, and good to see you out there in the stratosphere, virtual sphere. I think that that's an excellent question of how do we make these interventions beyond just the publication within our books and the journal articles, but how does it actually make an impact in the public sphere in these various spaces? And I have to say that it is very hard. I mean, there's been multiple times where I have been contacted and interviewed, and then ultimately not included in the article that was being published. And part of it is that speaking truth to power, I think oftentimes doesn't always fit within the news media paradigms themselves, in the more traditional, I would say, mainstream news paradigms, because there's community-based news that's being developed that, of course, is more than oftentimes willing to include those voices in there. But I think that one of the things that needs to happen, even if at the same time we're interviewed, but then not ultimately included, if we're contacted, for instance, I think reaching out to people still is a good thing to do. I mean, that's one of the things that I've done is sort of reach out to some journalists, say, hey, you might be interested in not just the work that I've been doing, but other folks that might be really great for you to interview. But it is still a challenge to be taken seriously in those spaces. So part of me also feels like then we've got to create our own spaces as well. How do we then, again, partner up with various different other news and communication and media production that can bring to light the work that we're doing instead. So not only just relying on the mainstream. For me, again, highlighting Presencia, I've worked very, very closely with my very good friend Vanessa Pavon, who is the executive producer of that show on WGBY, as a way of bringing students in these conversations to bear in that space. And so how do we then find those other spaces that are open and that are willing? And then because of course, I think the online public sphere has become digitized, why not create our own spaces to be able to have that? And I know that folks are creating YouTube channels, blogs. Of course, blogs are still being used, sometimes, but also like in terms of even participating in social media on Twitter and so forth, and participating that way. But it is a big challenge to still be included within the mainstream context. And I find that even when I attempt to, I'm not always necessarily quoted. And so my attempt has been more, okay, so how do we do it from these other sides? The other piece is working with community organizations. That's for me the most important place as well, because I want to live like in a very a local space of engagement. And so how do we have those conversations in those spaces? And also with teachers, for instance, I've also done a lot of work with some high schools locally in Springfield several years back as a way of bringing these issues to bear, as well, so that we really think of it as multiple layers of both impacting the public sphere and news media and these other spaces, but also how do we bring it at a very local level, and then also within our universities, as well. So it is a challenge, but I think that it is definitely possible. But I think we also have to create those spaces for ourselves, and then also participate and engage with those more community-based that oftentimes are seeking for those partnerships with universities, with faculty, with students that are seeing themselves in reciprocal relationships and not being utilized as a laboratory, but as a partner in these kinds of, social justice efforts as well.
I love the idea of like creating a pipeline while also acknowledging that perhaps certain mediums, whether it's like a blog or a podcast or like a YouTube channel, might be better access than some of these national broadcast news media, which of course you would like it to be differently, but perhaps targeting these other sources might be better, as well as also I think just targeting schools in the community. I like this idea of targeting it for multiple ways.
And I think really engaging, right? And really engaging with them, I think becomes really important, and for that reciprocity to take place, as well.
I agree. I also love how your framework talking about decolonizing methodologies. You mentioned language and colorism and all these other forms of isms in terms of how like Latinx experiences are either like racialized or discriminated against. And I love that framework because of course Latinidad is such a spectrum of color and experiences, and even I sometimes don't read as Latina to certain people, and then I do, but then I start speaking Spanish and then it becomes very visible, which kind of I wanted to ask, like, what is the role of language with either the phrases like build the wall or go back to Mexico? Like, I'm thinking of examples in the media where I think there were 2 US Latinas in North Dakota who were like speaking Spanish and that they were like picked up by ICE. And he made a comment, about them speaking Spanish. Or I think there was another New York lawyer who was picking up a sandwich and heard the employees there speaking Spanish and again use that frame like go back to Mexico. So I was wondering if you can speak a little bit to like how language fits into the national imaginary and how that also contributes to like anti Latino or Latinx rhetoric.
That's a great question. And in fact, I mean, I think that, oftentimes people, I mean, not that, scholars don't take language seriously, they absolutely do. But I think in terms of the more sort of general public sphere, language is sort of seen as this sort of like it exists out there, but it doesn't have any impact when it absolutely does. I think that someone that I actually want to mention is Jonathan Rosa. He's a professor, associate professor at Stanford, and he has his new book called Looking Like a Language, Sounding Like a Race. And I think really speaks to a lot of these issues. And I think also from a school context, as well. And so in terms of how language becomes an important part of that, I think him coming as both a linguistic anthropologist, sort of, background, and also being now in an educational sort of context as well. Also someone that does a lot of community-based work, critically and engagingly, is one of the ways that I think is important for how do we have different scholars looking at different things, because the reality is that we need multiple folks coming at it from multiple spaces in different ways, right? Because we can't do it all as sort of individual scholars. And again, this is why that both collaborative effort is so critical for bringing in those conversations of various different folks. And so he's someone that I look to in terms of getting more both up to speed, but also theoretically understanding it in a deeper way. As because I'm not an linguistic anthropologist, but he is. And so I think that that's for me. And of course, there's been also various scholars before that too, that have made an important inroads and contributions across the board. And so I think that that's the thing that I would say is that it's really important to sort of think about, but who are the scholars then who are writing about this? How do we cite them more? How do we include them in this conversation? And just because we're doing Latinx digital media studies, that doesn't mean that we only focus on scholars that are doing that work, but in fact expand it out and bring in. And I think that that's important too, for bringing in that multidisciplinary approach for understanding this, because that's what it's going to require to do that. And I think I'm also hoping that those scholars also bring us into the conversation too, bring us into those spaces of anthropology and sociology and so forth, because I think that's sometimes what happens in communication studies is that we borrow from a lot of folks, but a lot of folks don't always borrow from us, and sort of, and so the thing is, again, how do we make those connections to be able to promote each other's work, the important work that's taking place, and citing each other and engaging each other in these dialogues. And so, for instance, Jonathan did contribute. I mean, I am highlighting him because he also contributed a chapter to the other book that I did on civic engagement, which is a wonderful chapter. I mean, I think the whole book is great, but it's a wonderful chapter. And so, again, that's how I got to know him through that. But also, he was a colleague of mine at UMass. But his book just, I think, really speaks to that, really beautifully and very powerfully as well.
I'm also a fan of Jonathan Rosa's work, so I will definitely check out that chapter in your edited book. I like this idea of like almost like an undisciplinary between like scholarship going like back and forth, that hopefully will continue to grow. It would be really amazing to see either more linguistic anthropologists using more media and vice versa. So I really like that idea. We have another question here from the audience from Celeste. She writes, thank you so much for this great presentation. You've somewhat addressed this already, but I would like to ask you, how do you approach research that focuses on embodied knowledge of intersectionality issues of misogyny, racism, and classism, et cetera, and experiences of Latinidad through interviewing methods, for example, to give visibility to those experiences many times invisibilized, excuse me, while at the same time addressing the very important concern of not reproducing trauma. Thank you so much.
So you kind of cut in a little bit, in and out a little bit, so I didn't hear the whole. If you don't mind repeating it one more time, if that's okay.
No, not at all. She writes, you've somewhat addressed this already, but I would like to ask you, how do you approach research that focus on embodied knowledge of intersectional issues of misogyny, racism, and classism in experiences of Latinidad through interviewing methods, for example, to give visibility to those experiences many times invisibilized, while at the same time addressing the very important concerns of not reproducing trauma?
That's a great and heavy question. Right? It's a great question and an important one, because if you really are going to be about it, and if you're really going to be practicing what you're preaching, right, in terms of really taking into account that these intersectional experiences that we have and these lives in which we live, and at the same time not wanting to make sure that sometimes that those intersectional experiences are not always not always responded to with other people publicly in the same way, or in a positive way, or in a way that that people sort of take into account or appreciate, right? And so how do you are basically appreciating, acknowledging, honoring those experiences, that intersectional space in which we occupy, and at the same time trying to get at some of those issues that you might want to experience, that you may want to talk about, that maybe again full of joy and really great and wonderful depending on what it is, but there are also some of them that end up being much more harder to engage with, or can bring up those painful experiences. And I think part of it has to do with, how do we enter into those spaces with folks? How do we come to see ourselves as a collaborator in this co-construction of knowledge together, and also recognizing and honoring where they're located, and also being okay with them saying, you know what, this is okay to talk about, this is not okay to talk about, this is something that I want to discuss, or this is something that I'm just not ready to necessarily go there. And that's happened many times in some of the interviews that I've done with some of the work with folks. And part of it is also building that relationship with people, not seeing folks as you're my subject, you're my, you know, the interviewee. I mean, that's a very different sort of approach that doesn't, I feel like, does not take a decolonial or social justice orientation to how we do research, that really tries to unpack and dismantle those hierarchies in those spaces. And so really thinking that a little bit more carefully, and really seeing folks as co-partners in this building of knowledge together, and at the same time acknowledging that they have that experience and knowledge already. How do you bring that to bear? And also being very clear about, you know, is this, you know, having that honest and open conversation is, this is the thing I want to talk to you about. Is this something that is going to be okay with you? Or, you know, I don't want to, you know, inflict more harm or trauma in this space, giving this conversation. And sometimes folks have said, get back to me in a few weeks, because I'm still not ready to have that conversation. Originally, that actually happened recently. And I was like, this means that this project takes longer. This means that these conversations take longer. And they're not in timelines of the academic context. They're in timelines of people and community, and honoring that spirit and space that they occupy and that they hold. And so that's the difference too, is that we are not working then with timelines that are academically oriented. And that's a challenge for sure, you know, for those of us that are at tenure and promotion timelines and so forth. Anyways, lots to talk about there as well.
I'm afraid that we have reached our end of our time here. I wish we had more time, but I wanted to thank you so much for a wonderful seminar and a fruitful Q&A. I have so many other questions in terms of like applying this to concepts such as like Latinx for Black lives, which can be also very problematic and very interesting. So you've given me so much to think about. But thank you so much. and I look forward to applying this framework not only to scholarship, but also to teaching, which is an area that we could, especially for classes that are specifically designed or geared towards Latinx students. So this is amazing.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Crystal. I enjoyed this so much.
Yes, thank you very much. I just want to echo Crystal, Mary. Thank you so much for a terrific presentation, a great Q&A. Everything left me thinking a lot, but in particular your answer to the last question, which is, absolutely critical for the practice of research and the role of the academy in society. So thank you very, very much again. Thank you to our audience, and I hope everybody has a great rest of their weeks, and I invite everybody to join us again next week. We have Yedi Rivero from the University of Michigan, who will join us as our next speaker. So hope you stay warm in the middle of the winter, and those of you who are in winter time, and see you next week. Bye now.